Okay, so Chapter 9, Interest Groups. So the thing to know about interest groups, guys, is that they are a way for not only the people to organize political influence, but also for different organizations, okay? So you'll see what I mean as we go through this PowerPoint. So interest groups have a lot of influence over our campaigns. As you can see over here under campaign spending, we have around $6.1 billion spent in campaign spending. So remember that this is for trying to get different candidates into political office. We also have $13.6 billion in lobbying spending. Remember, this is usually for the use of interest groups to try and fund different strategies to be able to achieve what is on their platform. So, for example, you could have an interest group that is interested in influencing an outcome on an abortion bill. So they would most likely be working with the Democratic candidates and also paying them or donating money or doing whatever they can to try and get the position that they want, either a yay or a nay on abortion regulation. So, interest groups are any organization that actively seeks to influence public policy. They differ from a political party in that political parties address a very broad range of issues. Meanwhile, interest groups usually keep their goals to one or two. Federalism and the separation of powers provide multiple ways for interest groups to influence public policy, meaning at the national, the state, the local level, and then also within the three branches, the executive branch with the presidency, the legislature with the Congress, and the judicial with our Supreme Court. Groups that are highly organized stand a better chance of being heard, and this is because these groups tend to have organized ways to be able to get funds, organized ways to be able to get media attention, so on and so forth. So as you can see here, the U.S. is very much involved in the use of interest groups. So as you can see, other democratic Republican countries such as Germany, Great Britain, Italy, France, 61% and 33%. These numbers are referring to the percentage of people and or organizations that do not belong to an interest group. Meanwhile, only 18% of people do not belong to an interest group. 63% of people are involved in at least 1 to 3 interest groups, and 19% are involved in 4 or more. Okay, as you can see over here, that is a much higher percentage than any of these other countries. So, economic groups. These include groups that focus on economic purposes, such as jobs, higher wages, profits, or the protection of an occupation. So you have groups that are business groups that look out for companies such as Target, Microsoft, Apple, so on and so forth. We also have labor groups. These look out for our industrial workers and service sector workers, okay? People who work in a manufacturing setting or people who work in a service job. So for example, cashiers, retail workers, restaurant workers, typo there, sorry, and so on and so forth. My apologies for the restaurant typo. So, farm groups, this would be people such as agricultural farmers who work on plants. Okay, they do the planting, things like wheat, like rice, so on and so forth. And our ranchers, these are people who deal with livestock, like cows, chickens, so on and so forth. Okay, then we have our professional groups. So these are groups that focus on careers that usually require some type of higher education. So things like teachers, lawyers, doctors, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So as you can see, in our types of lobbying groups, we have 65% that belong to business firms and 35% that are our teachers unions, our farm groups, our labor groups. Okay, this means that businesses have a huge influence in our government. If you study the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, where we had the monopolies and all those arguments over working conditions, hours, those sorts of things, you know that business had a very huge impact on our government. It still continues today on a minor scale comparatively to that time period, but they still do have a pretty strong sway over our government's intentions. So we have citizens groups also. This would fall within that orange spectrum right here of these other types of groups. These are non-economic groups. Those motivated by what they regard as a worthy purpose. Things like immigration reform, environment regulation, abortion regulation, all those different things would fall under these citizens groups. So we have something known as purposive incentive. This is a strong inner wanting to make a change, basically joining the group for a purpose, to find and to convince their lawmakers to make a difference in regards to their goal. And then also material incentive. This is things like wage increases, hour guarantees, so on and so forth. They span the gamut, meaning they span a spectrum of advocating for civil liberties all the way to the natural environment. So in other words, there's a lot of different things that these citizens groups gather together for. We also have another really famous social grouping, the NAACP. This is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So this was formed around the time whenever African Americans had been released from slavery to try and help them to get a foothold in a society where they had been unable to flourish for so long, and trying to help them to overcome all of those different social, economic, and political hurdles that they would be facing. We also have single issue groups such as the NRA, so that's the National Rifle Association. Those would be fighting for gun rights. Okay, so as you can see, our Republican candidates and our Democratic candidates tend to lean pretty strong on different issue and interest groups. So as you can see, gun rights groups, pro-life groups tend to be supported by Republican candidates. Civil liberties, meaning civil rights, and environment type regulation, this would fall under our Democratic candidates. And this is because these groups really align with each party's platform and what they try to accomplish. So citizens groups are substantially outnumbered by economic groups, meaning that there are a whole lot more economic groups than there are citizens groups. Okay, so economic groups have access to abundant resources. These are the ones that our businesses fall under, and they of course have a lot more money than the average person. So we have private individual goods. These are benefits such as jobs that are given to particular individuals. And we also have non-economic groups offering collective public goods. These are all of the different, say, these citizens groups up here, all of those different goals that they are working for, the satisfaction of attaining those goals, having your name associated with a successful political movement, especially if you're trying to get your name in the ring to be able to run for Congress or what have you. And so because of this, a lot of them suffer from the free rider problem, meaning that we have a few individuals who work really hard and then a whole lot of individuals who kind of ride the tail feathers of their success, basically gaining the success of others' work. So size has both advantages and disadvantages. Business groups are usually smaller, they're more efficient. And then we have the AARP. Okay? So, lobbying. Lobbying are efforts by groups to influence public policy through contact with political officials. So this is through inside lobbying and outside lobbying. So inside lobbying is whenever you have a very close contact with a policymaker. In other words, they have an open line with a representative that they are able to actually go and talk to this representative, email with this representative, so on and so forth. And then we have outside lobbying. This is things like petitions and protests, where you're not having that direct contact with your representative, but you are making your opinions and your motivations known to that representative. It's especially effective whenever their constituents are putting together outside lobbying efforts, because they know if they don't respond to their needs, then these protesters will not vote for them again. So that means that if they don't follow what their constituents, what their voters want, then they run the danger of not being reelected. So modern lobbying rests on supplying officials with information, arguments, and evidence to back up their positions. So this means that in order for a lobbyist to really be able to make a significant impact, they must be able to have their research and be able to show the congressmen that they've done their homework. A lot of the times, these lobbyists will also create their own bills, and then they will send it to the congressman to try and break through all that red tape, just to say, hey, we've done our research, we've already put together what we want, this is how you can get it done, we've even already created the bill for you, all you have to do is take it to your committee. Okay, so we have a revolving door between lobbying firms and government. So basically what this means is that it's not unheard of for the representatives and the lobbyists to change places throughout the year. So what I mean by that is the lobbyist who's working for the representative, it's not unheard of for that lobbyist to be elected and then that representative then become the lobbyist. And they're constantly switching places with one another. So money is a key element. The amounts are staggering, meaning that there are a lot of outside quotations donations that happen to try and influence public policy. This is especially bad at our state level because our legislature at the Texas level is only paid $7,500 a year. So a lot of the money that they rely on comes from these lobbying efforts, which is why we see so much influence from them at the state level. So this also happens at the national level, just at a much more impacted, a lot more money going into these efforts. So the targets of inside lobbying are officials of 3 government branches. They work at all 3. We usually associate them with the legislative branch in the Congress, but they also do work with the executive branch, meaning the president, and with the judicial, especially whenever it comes to trying to influence the outcome of different court cases, especially those that have to do with things like civil rights, like we saw with the abortion bill. So the top spending lobbying group. So as you can see, pharmaceuticals over here has a lot of influence in our Congress, which is part of the reason why there was such an uproar with the Affordable Care Act. Insurance, same thing. We also have electronics, so those would be things like cell phone companies, computer companies, business associations, so different retail companies, oil and gas. A lot of those would have to do with our, a lot of this would be from Texas. Electric utilities, so this is to try and sway natural resource fueled electric power, such as coal versus the solar, the wind. Real estates, we have hospitals and financial. This would be our banking industry, and then the manufacturing industry, all those different factories, and then also the plants over in places like Houston where they process things like oil and those sorts of things. So we have two different types of webs of influence. So one is the iron triangle. Way to remember this is it's ironclad. It's not going anywhere. This is a small and informal but relatively stable set of bureaucrats, so that means the people outside of the president's office, legislatures, meaning our congressmen, and lobbyists. These are brought together by a common interest. So, for example, terrorism. This is a very not only important but permanent faction now within our government. Has a lot of influence over things like a national security policy, that sort of thing. We also have issue networks that are formed whenever there is a problem that seems temporary in nature. So this is an informal grouping of officials, lobbyists, policy specialists, and they come together to support a temporarily visible problem. So they're brought together by an immediate issue. For example, coronavirus. We had an issue network that the vice president under Trump was a part of. Pence became the group head of the coronavirus committee. This was an issue network that was brought together to address the coronavirus issue. Now, something interesting that can happen here, a lot of these iron triangles start out as issue networks. So, for example, coronavirus been around for a couple years now, right? So this will most likely turn into an iron triangle, trying to figure out how to address the problem on a long-term basis. So the issue networks are the more frequent pattern today, brought together to solve temporary problems, and they'll either stay in issue network and then be disbanded once the issue is taken care of, or they'll turn into this iron triangle as an issue that needs to constantly be monitored. So outside lobbying, some groups rely solely on inside lobbying. So this is usually represent an important constituency. So people like businesses who want their policy to be pushed forward. Outside lobbying, this is a lot of pressure to bear on policymakers, and this is through things like those petitions, through marches and protests, and all these different things. There's a lot of grassroots lobbying, so remember that grassroots means local issues. So these are people who are lobbying their representative for local issues within their state, and then electoral action. So this has to do with campaigns and elections. So inside lobbying, it's developing contacts with legislators and executives, providing information to key officials, forming coalitions with groupings with other groups. So in other words, if you have two groups that have very similar goals, so if you have a women's rights group and then also an abortion group, those would most likely form a coalition, meaning they would work together. We have also outside lobbying. So this is encouraging group members to contact their representatives, things like emails, phone calls to their representative, promoting their message through advertising, public relations, in other words, getting the message out through different media companies, social media especially, and then supporting political candidates through money and endorsements, meaning giving their congressman the money to be able to influence the policy. So, outside lobbying includes efforts such as letter writing, campaigns, public demonstration. So, this is a specialty of our National Rifle Association, which is adept at mobilizing its 3 million members. So, for example, you remember when a lot of people were carrying their guns and their rifles that open carry around. This was a demonstration of protection of the Second Amendment, organized by that National Rifle Association. And it was done nationally, meaning that you saw this in a lot of different states, which means that this group has a lot of influence over its members and over policy. So, political action committees, PACs, these are organizations that pool and donate campaign contributions. The amount a PAC can contribute to a single candidate is legally limited. So, most PACs are associated with businesses. So, the businesses, in other words, are the ones who give a lot of these PACs the money. And then they contribute roughly 8 times as much money to incumbents than challengers. So as you can see, the incumbents usually receive around 87% of PAC contributions, and their challengers only 13%. If you remember from the past elections, a lot of the time our incumbents win. So, for example, George Bush, whenever he ran again, won the election. Barack Obama, whenever he won again, won the election. The incumbent is the person who has held the seat before and is running again to be able to, to basically be able to stay within that seat. 9 times out of 10, they win that election. So PACs will put their money towards the incumbents, especially in campaigns and that sort of thing, because they don't want to support someone who statistically is not going to win, because it is a lot of money. So super PACs are independent, expenditure-only committees. Okay, so these emerged after the ruling in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission and other different cases. Basically, they're not allowed to directly contribute to or coordinate with a party or a candidate, but they do find ways around this, working with different interest groups and that sort of thing to kind of pull money in, working their way basically around the system. So they have unrestricted fundraising and spending. So they take their money and they gather it and try to work their way around the hurdles any way they can. The disclosure of donors is not required. So in other words, these super PACs can basically take in money off the books. They don't have to say where the money came from, and because of that, this is a subject of intense debates, especially because these super PACs do find ways around these regulations. So the group system. So pluralist theory holds that organized groups are a source of sound governance, basically meaning that groups are a way for citizens to be heard. Remember, we operate off of a thing known as a social contract. This was practiced whenever the colonists first battled with Great Britain and fought with Great Britain. Basically, the idea behind the revolution was if your government is not serving your needs, then you have the right to rebel. So our government is founded off of this idea, so they know that this could still be an issue. So because of that, there are many different ways and many different levels in which citizens can get involved, so that way the government can uphold this social contract. So groups are a means of getting the government to pay attention to people's needs and their interests, which is why people join these interest groups. So government serves the interests of the majority while protecting those of the minority. Basically, when a party is in power, let's say the Democratic Party, which holds powers on the executive branch right now, they will try to usually work with the minor party, the party not in power. So right now that would be the Republican Party. One, to try and minimize any conflict, and two, so that those who do associate with the Republican Party feel that they are being heard. So political parties tend to focus on broad issues. Your book says it's leery of controversial ones. I would have to really disagree with this statement. Your book says it's leery. I like to say that they kind of concentrate on these controversial ones, especially during election times. Example would be mask regulations for coronavirus, this whole abortion debate that's still going on, debates on immigration regulation. All of these very tender subjects would be controversial, so I'd have to argue with the book on that one. And interest groups expand the range of issues that are addressed because they allow people to be able to get their voices heard on many different issues. So, where is the public interest when special interests can determine the policies affecting them? So, a lobbying group accomplishes what a lobbying group accomplishes is not necessarily what the majority would want. A lot of the times they still have to compromise with these lawmakers and with the party that would be supporting them to be able to keep a good relationship with them. And lawmakers of each party are in the habit of using the government to promote the interests of the groups they favor. So, especially the groups that support their party's platform and their platform. The interest group system is not equally representative. So, as we saw in this pie chart up here, scroll up to it real quick. People's voices are not equally represented, right? Our businesses and trades associations, all these different things, 65% of them are the lobbying groups in Washington, D.C. That means at the national level. Only 35%, meaning those environmental groups, women's rights groups, civil rights groups, are within this 35%. So, people's groups are not equally represented. So, the interest group system not being equally representative is because well-funded interests have more clout, like those business interests, and nearly 2/3 of all lobbying groups are business-related. So in the Federalist Paper number 10, written by Mr. Madison, a free society must allow the pursuit of self-interest. So our checks and balances system works to protect these rights at the local, meaning the city level, county level, state level, national level, and between all of those, the executive branch, the legislative, and the judicial branch. They exaggerate the influence of special interest groups, especially those that have more money, and groups can wield too much influence over individual policies or agendas, as we saw with the very uneven influence represented in this pie chart, right? So, how the 50 states differ in lobbyists. So, as you can see, very big business type states like Texas, like New York, so on and so forth. Florida, we have a lot of tourism businesses here like Disney, Universal Studios, all those different places. They have a lot of lobbyists, okay? These yellow states represent those that kind of in the middle. They don't have a whole lot compared to the other states. but they also don't have a very minimal amount. And these blue states, places like Oklahoma, Nebraska, North Dakota, these are states that tend to favor not using lobbyists as much. So that is it for Chapter 9. I will see you for Chapter 10. Have a great day. Bye.